Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into one of the most influential economic ideas of the 20th century. Seriously, this one idea completely changed the game when it comes to how we all think about inflation.
You've probably heard this famous line from the economist Milton Friedman. And look, it's a powerful argument. It's simple, it's elegant, but the whole thing, everything, rests on one single critical idea. And as we're about to see, that idea might just be a little shaky. For Friedman's whole theory to work, he had to prove that our desire to hold on to cash is predictable. Why is that so important? Well, because if our demand for money is stable, then any big economic problem, like inflation, has to be coming from the other side, from changes in the money supply.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll get into what Friedman was really trying to do. Then we'll look at a super important bit of fine print in his argument. We'll check out the four big assumptions holding it all together, watch them start to crumble, look at the cold, hard data, and finally, we'll talk about why any of this really matters today.
So first things first, what was Friedman's main objective here? He basically needed to find a stable target, an anchor, for his entire theory to work.
And that anchor was money demand. You can think of it as the economy's overall appetite for holding cash. If that appetite is stable and predictable, right, then if the economy gets a fever, like inflation, it must be because the central bank is just pumping in way too much money. It puts the money supply squarely in the spotlight as the main bad guy.
But this is where things get really interesting. Because the evidence Friedman found didn't quite prove what most people think it did. And this is the crucial nuance we have to understand. Okay, so this slide gets right to the heart of it. What Friedman's research actually showed was that the recipe for demanding money stays pretty consistent. The same ingredients, like our income, what interest rates are doing, they always matter. That's what we call functional stability. But, and this is a huge but, for his big theory on inflation to work, he needed to prove quantitative stability. He needed to show that the actual amount of money we want to hold is stable and predictable. And let me tell you, those are two completely different things.
So how in the world did he get from a stable recipe to a stable amount? Well, he had to build a kind of logical bridge. And that bridge was made up of four very big, and as it turns out, very unproven assumptions. Let's go see what those are.
So Friedman's entire case for a stable quantity of money demand was really propped up by these four key pillars. If they're solid, his theory is golden. But if they start to wobble, well, that's a whole different story. And here they are. These are the pillars. The idea that the rules of the economic game never change, that money is always useful in pretty much the same way, that certain gaps in interest rates don't really matter, and that the real economy and the money supply are like two separate universes. If just one of these pillars falls apart, the whole argument gets pretty unstable.
All right, it's time to do some stress testing. Let's see if these four pillars can actually hold up under the weight of the real, modern financial world.
First up, are the relationships between all these variables really constant? The reality? Not even close. Just think about it. Today, you can move your money from a savings account into stocks with a few taps on your phone. That's financial innovation. It crushes transaction costs, and it means that even a tiny little change in interest rates can make us massively shift our desire to hold cash. The old rules just don't apply anymore.
Okay, next pillar. Is money always useful in the same way? No way. When things get scary, like during a financial crisis, the whole purpose of cash changes. It's not just for buying stuff. It becomes a safe haven. Cash is suddenly king, and our demand to just hoard it can go through the absolute roof. So much for predictability.
So, pillar number 3 assumes that the gaps between interest rates are stable. But in the real world, they're anything but. That gap between short-term and long-term rates, what we call the yield curve, is one of the most watched indicators in the economy precisely because it moves around so much, signaling good times and bad. And those swings directly affect whether we want to hold on to cash or lock it up in longer-term bonds.
And now for the last pillar, the idea that the money supply and the real economy are two totally separate things. That doesn't really hold up either. If an economy isn't running at full steam, say there's high unemployment, then pumping more money into the system can actually boost investment, create jobs, and raise real incomes. And guess what happens when people have more real income? Their demand for money goes up too. So the money supply can directly mess with money demand, creating this feedback loop the theory just ignores.
So the theoretical pillars are looking, well, pretty shaky. But what about the hard evidence? Let's forget theory for a second and see what the data actually tells us about our demand for money.
All right, the hard data is pretty much the final verdict.
Here's the deal. If our demand for money was stable, then the velocity of money, that's just a fancy term for how fast a dollar gets spent and respent, should also be stable. But the evidence? It shows the exact opposite. After the 2008 financial crisis, you can see here the velocity for M1 and M2 just plummeted. It fell off a cliff. People got nervous and started hoarding cash. The demand for money became anything but stable and predictable.
So we've walked through the theory, we've kicked the tires on the assumptions, and we've looked at the data. What's the big takeaway from all this? Why does it matter?
The really crucial point here is that this beautifully simple story, that inflation is just about the money supply, it's built on a foundation that just isn't solid. The real world is way messier than that. You've got financial innovation, economic uncertainty, all these feedback loops. All of it makes our demand for money incredibly hard to pin down. And that means the link between the money supply and inflation is a whole lot more complicated than the simple story suggests.
And that leaves us with this final, pretty provocative question. If the public's appetite for money is constantly shifting in ways we can't predict, how much good does it do for a central bank to only focus on controlling the supply? That's a question economists and policymakers are still wrestling with every single day. Thanks for watching.